The white noise of the snow squall clawed at the walls of the temporary research shack, a constant abrasive reminder that they were 300 miles from anything that counted as civilization. Dr. Elias Vance, lean and driven to the point of gauntness, ignored the grinding sound. His focus was pinned to the thermal monitor, which displayed the sluggish, almost impossible movement of the Ursus Maritimus. They called Subject 79. 79 is holding the ridge, Elias, muttered Finn, the veteran field biologist, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. Finn was the grounding force, the one who constantly checked the fuel lines and the satellite uplink. Elias was the fire. Elias did not look up. He shouldn't be. Not at this density of pack ice. The primary migration routes shifted south a decade ago. 79 is an anomaly. He's going exactly where the original pre-modern genome lines dictate. It proves my theory, Finn. Finn sighed, the sound muffled by his heavy fleece. Elias's theory was that a specific, deep-rooted genetic cohort of bears followed ancient, pre-industrial migration paths that were considered geographically impossible today. It wasn't enough to track the bears. Elias needed a physical specimen from that cohort tagged and studied in situ. He was staking his entire career and Finn's reputation on this long-shot final push. A frantic, high-pitched ping ripped through the calm. "We have him!" Elias barked, grabbing his emergency rifle. "He's stationary, trapped between two pressure ridges. Perfect immobilization window." They mounted the snowmobiles, the headlamps slicing weak yellow cones through the swirling blue dusk. The wind chill hit the exposed skin like a physical blow, promising immediate frostbite. After 10 brutal minutes, they reached the ridge. Subject 79, a massive male, lay tranquilized, his breathing slow and heavy in the frigid air. Elias began attaching the GPS collar, the neoprene cold under his gloved fingers. Finn took the standard tissue samples. Everything was routine, until Finn let out a gasp that vaporized instantly in the 40-degree-Celsius air. "Elias, stop! Look at this!" Deeply embedded beneath the matted fur of the bear's neck, resting against the muscle ridge, was a secondary collar. It was tarnished, dark green-black, and made of heavy, intricately detailed brass. The metal was ancient, scarred by centuries of friction, and patterned with symbols Elias couldn't immediately identify. "It's pre-1900, Elias whispered, his scientist's awe overriding the survival instinct. "It looks Georgian or Victorian, maybe even older. How could a wild polar bear have worn this for that long?" Finn pulled his hand back, shivering violently, though not just from the cold. The chopper pilot called. "Elias, the ice shelf near the main landing zone is breaking up faster than predicted. The monitoring station gives us 72 hours. Until that runway is swallowed by the ocean. We need to finalize the tagging, pack the base, and get out, regardless of what that metal artifact is." Elias held the heavy brass, the weight of history in his palm, suddenly eclipsing the urgency of the ice. He had the bear, he had the evidence, and now he had a mystery that threatened to prove more than his migration theory. It threatened to redefine the known history of the Arctic. The clock had started. 72 hours to get off the ice, or 72 hours to unravel an impossible truth. The cramped research shack felt smaller, tighter, compressed by the weight of the ice and the impossibility of the artifact sitting on the battered steel table. Elias had barely registered the bite of the cold or the mechanical drone of the diesel generator since they got back. He'd spent the last 4 hours, 4 of their rapidly shrinking 72 hours, meticulously cleaning the collar with a fine brush and mineral spirits. The brass was denser than he expected, possessing an unnatural heft. The deep green patina began to flake away, revealing the underlying craftsmanship. It wasn't crudely stamped, it was engraved with terrifying precision. The symbols weren't Nordic runes or Inuktitut syllabics. They were angular, almost biological, like rigid, branching organisms trapped in metal. Some appeared to be a stylized representation of the Arctic sky. Others looked like the teeth of a fish he'd never seen before. "Elias, we're burning daylight and fuel," Finn said, his voice taut with suppressed panic as he ran diagnostics on the satellite phone. "That runway report is unstable. We need to start the major pack-up now. We can bag the collar, take photos, and analyze it safely in Winnipeg." Elias didn't even glance at him. "You don't understand, Finn. This changes everything. My initial hypothesis on migration patterns? Secondary. This collar predates the known exploration of this region by at least a century, maybe two. And look at these symbols." Elias gestured to a swirling, deep groove near the clasp. "They're not merely decorative, they're functional, like a locking mechanism or a containment field." His fatal flaw, the intellectual hubris that demanded full, immediate comprehension, seized control. His reputation hinged on discovery, not safety. How could he leave the single most significant artifact of his career just to catch a scheduled flight? "Finn, we have 68 hours left. That's enough time for a preliminary scan of the structure and a full photographic record. If we pack this now, we lose the environmental context. We lose the magnetic resonance data. We lose everything." Finn slumped onto his cot, defeated by Elias's intensity. "We lose the runway, Elias. We lose survival." Elias ignored the threat, focusing the macro lens of his field microscope onto the collar. The brass was faintly radioactive, emitting a tiny, barely measurable heat signature that the Arctic air seemed to actively extinguish. Finn didn't know the weight of bearing such a truth, the burden of the scientist who sees the crack in history's facade. How many hours would you risk to prove the world wrong about everything it thought it knew? Elias couldn't conceive of leaving. The cold outside was terrifying, but the unknown history locked within the brass was infinitely more compelling. Step 3. First practical obstacle, 25%. Dificuldade física técnica. The first real obstacle didn't come from the ice or the dwindling time, now approximately 60 hours remaining, but from the equipment. Elias had devised a makeshift electromagnetic scanner, rigging 3 different power sources together with enough wire to tie up a small ship. His goal was simple: map the structure of the brass collar to determine its precise alloy composition and age. He placed the collar on the insulated pad. When he threw the main circuit breaker, the generator outside didn't just whine, it shrieked. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke immediately billowed into the shack through the narrow vent, carrying the sharp metallic smell of burning oil and insulation. "Shut it down!" Finn yelled, diving for the auxiliary breaker panel. Elias reacted too slowly, fixated on the collar. For a split second, as the power surged then died, the artifact itself glowed. Not with the orange heat of resistance, but with a frigid, alien blue light, illuminating the ancient, terrible symbols carved into its surface. It lasted less than a second, then darkness. The generator had seized, dead. Finn stood over the ruined machine, breathing heavily, his face smudged with soot. "That's it, Elias. We just lost 50% of our power capacity and 80% of our heating reserve. The diesel line is damaged too. We don't have the spare parts or the daylight to fix this properly. We're relying entirely on the battery banks and the emergency backup heater." The temperature inside the shack, usually held at a manageable 15 degrees Celsius, began to plummet immediately. Elias felt the creeping, paralyzing cold invade his boots, moving up his legs. "We can't just stop, Finn," Elias argued, his breath steaming thick and white in the air. "That blue light, that wasn't electrical feedback, that was activation. It was a power surge melting the copper windings, Elias. Focus, we are now in a survival scenario. We lose battery power in 6 hours if we keep the radio uplink running, and without heat, we have maybe 18 hours before the shack becomes an ice tomb. We have to call the air team, explain the situation, and demand immediate extraction, now." Elias knew Finn was right. Logic dictated retreat, but the vision of that pulsating blue light had overwritten all common sense. He touched the brass collar, which felt colder now than the ambient temperature. Impossibly cold. "No call yet," Elias said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We switch the batteries to minimal life support, just the emergency beacon and the handheld GPS. We use the field camera to document the symbols before the cold makes my fingers useless. We still have the time, Finn. We just lost the comfort." Finn looked around the shack, at the deep shadows stretching across the floor, at the frantic condensation forming on the interior metal. "This is the kind of hubris that gets teams frozen solid on the front page, Elias. Everyone who knows the North knows you don't gamble with the generator." Was Elias merely a dedicated scientist, or was he willfully inviting the Arctic's wrath by clinging to this artifact? The lines were blurring quickly, pushed by the paralyzing cold and the knowledge that every minute of continued research was a theft from their rapidly expiring chance of survival. And step 4, complexity and subplots, aprofundamento sensorial, plus CTA invisível de comunidade. With the generator silent, the vast, suffocating silence of the high Arctic pressed in. The only sound was the desperate whir of the single battery-operated fan struggling to circulate air and the distant grinding whisper of the pack ice moving offshore. Elias, wrapped in 4 layers of thermal gear, worked furiously under the harsh light of a headlamp clamped to the table edge. He was using a high-resolution field camera to capture macro images of the brass collar. The air temperature inside was now barely above freezing. He could see his breath clouding over the lens if he wasn't careful. The brass collar felt different. The light he'd seen wasn't the only change. It was starting to smell. A deep subterranean odor, like ozone mixed with ancient rust and something profoundly organic, like frozen earth ripped open. "Did you notice the color change?" Elias asked, his voice strained from the cold and lack of sleep. Finn, huddled by the emergency heater trying to conserve the battery, didn't look up. "Everything changes color when you're freezing, Elias. Your fingers are probably blue right now." "No, the color, it's darkening. And look at this," Elias insisted, adjusting the focus. He'd found a microscopic seam near the clasp, hidden by centuries of corrosion. When he focused the light, he realized the symbols weren't carved into the brass. They were etched into a layer of smooth, incredibly dense black material that had been fused to the inner surface of the collar. This inner lining, it's not brass. It looks like obsidian, but impossibly smooth, and the material has a texture, like dry, scaly skin. "Touch it, Finn." Finn recoiled slightly. "I'm not touching that thing, Elias. It shorted our primary power. It's clearly bad luck, if not worse." Elias carefully inserted a thin metal probe into the seam. He felt an agonizingly faint click. A section of the black lining, no bigger than a thumbnail, hinged inward, exposing the interior. Inside the collar, Elias saw nothing but smooth, empty space, except for a tiny pinprick of light that wasn't reflecting anything. It was generating light, a microscopic, chilling blue flicker, perfectly steady. "It's not empty," Elias breathed, his voice catching. "It's hollowed out. And there's something moving inside." Finn finally approached, compelled by a fear greater than his caution. He peered into the tiny opening, his eyes watering from the cold. "I don't see movement, Elias. I see a blue static." "No, look closely. It's a rhythmic pulse, slow, like a heartbeat, but 1,000 times slower. It's not static, Finn. It's contained energy." Elias pulled back, his hand trembling uncontrollably. Whatever this collar was designed to do, it's not passive. It's still running. The sound of the wind suddenly changed pitch, becoming a low, resonant groan, as if the entire ice shelf was exhaling. Outside, a shadow passed the frosted window, too fast, too large for a natural cloud, and moving against the wind. Any experienced field researcher knows that when the wind stops sounding like air and starts sounding like a lament, something ancient is listening. We have approximately 54 hours remaining. The cold was becoming a physical presence, a third malevolent entity in the shack. Step 5. The midpoint. Dilemma moral. Pil. Primera grande virada reversan. The internal blue flicker of the collar intensified slowly, agonizingly, mirroring the increasing pressure in Elias's skull. He knew what he had to do next, a desperate measure that flew in the face of every safety protocol. He had to find where the original bear, Subject 79, had been sleeping. "We need to track 79's path back to the moment we tagged him," Elias stated, packing the GPS receiver. "That collar wasn't just on him, it was fused to him. We need to find where he got it, where he hibernated, the point of origin." Finn was trying to generate enough heat friction to start the auxiliary stove, his movements stiff and slow. "Absolutely not. It's almost fully dark. The weather is closing in. We only have enough battery to last the night. We need to save the snowmobile's fuel for the escape, not an archaeological dig, Elias. If this artifact is this old, Finn, the location he wore, it will be significant. A grave site, an ancient outpost, something that proves this isn't just a lost trinket. This is the only way to justify losing the generator and risking our lives. We prove it, or we die trying. This was Elias's core dilemma, morality versus discovery. He chose discovery, driven by his consuming hubris. They used the snowmobile sparingly, idling the engines only long enough to check the GPS coordinates of Subject 79's tracking collar. The trail led them southwest, away from the coastal shelf and the unstable runway, deep into the glacier field. After 2 harrowing hours navigating sheer ice walls and unstable drifts, the GPS beacon indicated the bear had stopped for an extended period, a deep hibernation den precisely underneath a massive, overhanging ice formation, shaped like a colossal frozen wave. They dismounted, the cold biting through their boots instantly. The temperature felt colder here, somehow denser, as if the air itself was heavier. Elias approached the ice wave cautiously. He could feel the cold radiating from the formation, but it was different from the normal Arctic chill. It felt sterile, almost metallic. Elias chipped away at the base with an ice axe. The ice cracked with unnerving ease. The sound was flat, dead, not the sharp tink of solid glacier ice. Behind the fractured surface, there was a gap, and through the gap, Elias shone his headlamp. The first great reversal. It wasn't a bear den. It was an entrance, a carved archway of black non-ice material shaped like a mouth opening into the ground. It was clearly unnatural, perfectly rectangular and impossibly smooth. It looked like polished basalt but shimmered unnaturally in the lamp's beam. Inside, the beam vanished into absolute light-devouring darkness. The structure was clearly subterranean. "Finn, look," Elias whispered, his voice trembling less from the cold and more from the realization. "We're not the first to find this. This isn't a natural formation. This is architecture." Finn staggered back, dropping his ice axe, which clattered dully on the packed snow. The ancient smell, the ozone and rust, was overwhelming here, pouring out of the gap like an invisible tide. "It looks like an air vent, Elias. A tomb. We need to leave. Now. We have 52 hours. Elias, however, saw his justification. The collar wasn't a fluke. It was a key. If you had 52 hours to live and the ultimate truth of the world lay behind a door, would you turn back? Step 6. Consequences of the virada. O tempo apita, ajuste chronologico. The discovery of the submerged structure sealed their fate. For Elias, the retreat was no longer an option. It was a betrayal of his intellectual calling. The cold, the lack of power, and the impending loss of the runway, now only 48 hours away, were merely logistical inconveniences. Finn, whose survival instinct was stronger than Elias's intellectual thirst, was breaking down the chain of command. "This is not science, Elias. This is a suicide pact," Finn hissed, his voice cracking from the exertion of prying a solid section of ice away from the entrance. "That structure hasn't seen air in 1,000 years, maybe 10,000. We have no support, no reliable communication, and we're running on fumes. We need to turn back, hit the radio, and pray they can get a ski plane here before the entire shelf collapses." Elias had already entered the opening. The darkness was absolute, heavy and silent. His headlamp beam struggled against the suffocating void. The air inside felt strangely humid, yet painfully cold, smelling of crushed minerals and the persistent faint ozone. "Look at the walls, Finn," Elias called back, his voice echoing in the unexpected space. The interior was a downward-sloping corridor, smoothly carved. The stone, or whatever the black material was, felt impossibly slick, absorbing all light. The corridor was unnaturally silent, the exterior sounds of the Arctic wind completely nullified. Finn peered in, his face etched with pure dread. "I'm not coming in, Elias. We agreed. You take photos, you take readings, we get out. We spend 10 minutes. That's all the time we can afford to borrow." Elias stepped further inside. He didn't respond to Finn. He was already captivated by the subtle, terrible details etched into the walls. They were covered in the same branching, rigid symbols found on the brass collar, repeating endlessly down the dark, sloping path. It was an ancient, silent language of pain and cold. As Elias reached deeper into the structure, the brass collar he had placed securely in his innermost parka pocket began to pulse gently against his ribs. The pressure was slight, more vibration than heat, but it was noticeable. He pulled the collar out and held it up. The tiny blue light, visible through the small opening he'd created, was now throbbing faster, radiating a faint blue corona that danced across the black walls. Did the bear simply find this place, or was the collar designed to guide its wearer back to this location? "It's reacting, Finn!" Elias shouted, exhilarated despite the profound cold. "The collar is a locator. We're following the right trail." A deep metallic clang echoed up from the black depths below. It sounded like something immense shifting on stone, vibrating up through the floor and into their boots. It wasn't the sound of settling ice. It was the sound of something being unlocked. Finn screamed, a raw sound of sheer terror. He stumbled backward, scrambling to regain the opening. "We've triggered something, Elias. Get out, now!" Elias, gripped by the terror and the wonder, froze. The rhythmic pulsing of the collar accelerated wildly in his hand. Step 7. False hope. Pares que vai dar certo, mas a fala atrapala. Elias ignored Finn's desperate cries. The cold was a dull throb now, overridden by the electrical thrill surging through him. The pulsing brass collar felt hot against his bare palm, yet radiated no heat. It felt like holding a living heart, made of frozen metal. The deep corridor opened into a chamber. Elias aimed his headlamp. It wasn't a chamber carved by nature or simple excavation. It was a vast, hemispherical space, the ceiling lost to the dark, and its walls were covered entirely in the smooth, black, scaly material. The effect was dizzying, like standing inside the hollowed skull of a gargantuan beast. At the center of the chamber stood a monolithic block of the same black stone, clearly an altar or a pedestal. Upon it rested the faint impression of something large that had been stationary for millennia. A second, profound discovery distracted Elias from the ringing sound of terror still echoing in his ears. Littered around the base of the pedestal were artifacts, not brass, but bone. Massive, fossilized vertebrae and segments of rib cage, far larger than any known polar bear or mammoth. And interspersed among the bones were dozens of smaller, intricate objects crafted from the same unique brass alloy as the collar. Lockets, tiny spherical boxes, and several keys. "We need to document this, Finn," Elias said, his voice trembling with sheer, overwhelming intellectual greed. "This is not human architecture. This is something else. This confirms it. Subject 79 was a guardian of this site, wearing the key to its location." Finn, still standing frozen at the entrance, finally moved forward, less driven by curiosity than by the need to pull Elias out. He was clutching the emergency satellite phone, his gloved fingers hovering over the transmit button. 10 minutes, Elias. I mean it this time. If I press this button, they'll know we're here and they might divert the chopper for an unscheduled pickup. But we need to be on the surface. Elias, lost in the artifacts, barely registered the threat. He picked up one of the small brass lockets. It was warm to the touch and pulsed with a faint internal blue light, just like the collar. Suddenly, a realization struck him, driven by his specialized knowledge of Arctic wildlife. Bears do not scavenge. They do not collect and guard. He turned his beam to the walls again. The pattern of the branching symbols was dense here. He traced one with a fingertip. It didn't feel like stone. It felt organic, like cold, dormant cartilage. He had a moment of clarity, a false hope that he could solve the entire mystery in 5 minutes. Finn, the chamber is pressurized. The silence means it's sealed. The vibration we heard? It wasn't an unlocking. It was the ice shifting, breaching the seal slightly. Elias explained, his voice confident. We are safe as long as we don't destabilize the ceiling. We grab the key evidence and we're gone. Just as he said the word safe, the air quality changed drastically. The smell of ozone and rust intensified into a metallic, choking vapor. The air became heavy, like breathing liquid nitrogen. Then, one of the small brass boxes on the ground near Elias moved. It didn't roll, it lifted, shuddered and spun in place, generating a high-pitched, almost inaudible shriek that pierced their thermal helmets. Finn dropped the satellite phone. The single sound of plastic cracking on the black stone floor was deafening. The screen remained stubbornly dark. The radio link was destroyed. We have approximately 45 hours remaining. Retreat had just become a forced march. Step 8. The crisis. 75% tudo da errado, perda total. The destruction of the satellite phone was total. Finn, realizing the full magnitude of their isolation, emitted a low, choking sound of despair. They were cut off, locked in a sub-zero tomb with less than 40 hours. Until the ice runway they needed simply ceased to exist. You, Elias. This is on you! Finn gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the collar pulsing maniacally in Elias's grip. We had our chance, we had the time, but your obsession, you just destroyed our only lifeline. Elias felt a cold flush of responsibility, momentarily piercing the fog of his intellectual pursuit. But the immediate visceral threat snapped his focus back to the chamber. The small brass box that had spun was now vibrating violently, emanating a deafening high-frequency pitch. All the brass artifacts, the lockets, the keys, even the large collar in Elias's hand, were humming in response, their blue lights flashing rapidly. Then, the true horror of the chamber revealed itself. The walls were not merely covered in black stone. They were alive. The rigid, branching symbols began to glow with the same chilling blue light. The light didn't illuminate. It defined. It emphasized the deep, complex patterns, revealing that the walls were covered in billions of microscopic, perfectly hexagonal scales. As the hum intensified, the scales rippled and shifted, contracting and expanding like the skin of a deep-sea creature. The stone chamber was contracting. Elias screamed, dropping the collar, which hit the stone floor with a sharp, resonant thud. It's not architecture, Finn. It's biological. Get out! They scrambled toward the entrance, the sloping corridor now seeming miles long. The sound of the contracting chamber was like 10,000 bones grinding together, a deep, resonant crunch that threatened to shatter their eardrums. As they reached the exit point, where the structure met the glacier ice, the black opening began to seal itself. The slick, organic material flowed inward, smooth and silent, shrinking the aperture into a vertical slit. They plunged through the narrowing gap, scraping their thermal suits on the razor-sharp, freezing edges. Elias went first, tumbling out onto the snow. He looked back just in time to see Finn, who was heavier and slower, catch his foot. "Help me! It's closing!" Finn yelled, pushing desperately against the contracting wall. Elias grabbed Finn's arm, pulling with all his strength. But the pressure of the closing mouth of the structure was immense, fueled by ancient non-mechanical force. With a final sickening crunch, the aperture slammed shut. Elias collapsed onto the snow, covered in ice and fear. He looked back at the massive ice wave, now perfectly smooth, where the entrance had been, with no sign of the black, living stone. He looked down at his hand. Finn's glove was still clutched in his grip. The sleeve of the parka, where the arm had been, was cleanly severed, caught within the sealed chamber. Elias sat on the ice, the freezing wind stinging his face, and screamed until his throat was raw. He was alone. The structure had closed. Finn was gone, and their only radio was shattered inside the tomb. The ancient collar was still inside. He was now running on a single snowmobile, with limited fuel, alone, with the less than 38 hours left to reach a runway that was likely dissolving into the ocean. Step 9. The Dark Night of the Soul, Reflexo Interna, plus CTA Invisível de Dilema Moral. The Arctic night was complete. A blinding, absolute blackness, relieved only by the agonizing shimmer of the aurora borealis, a curtain of green and blue light that felt mocking rather than beautiful. Elias sat on the single operational snowmobile, 5 miles from the sealed chamber, refusing to start the engine. The engine was their last hope, their final ticket to the dissolving runway. He needed to conserve every drop of fuel. He was in shock, the cold finally penetrating his remaining layers. His hands were shaking so violently he could hear his thermal gloves rustle. Finn's severed glove lay on the seat next to him, a terrible, final accusation. It was the intellectual hubris. The need to prove, not to survive. Elias had sacrificed his colleague, his partner, for a piece of ancient brass and the ghost of a scientific paper that might never be published. Finn had been right about everything. The generator, the immediate escape, the danger of the artifact. Elias had dismissed him, prioritizing discovery over humanity. He had gathered only 2 things from the chamber: the high-resolution field camera, tucked safely inside his parka, and the faint, metallic, subterranean smell clinging to his suit. He needed to review the photos. He needed to know what Finn died for. He pulled the camera out, his frozen fingers struggling with the small buttons. The display screen flickered on, illuminating his gaunt, horrified face. He scrolled past the images of the smooth walls, the bone fragments, and the pedestal. He stopped at the final sequence, a close-up of the tiny brass box that had started moving. In the macro image, he could see the hexagonal scales of the chamber wall reflected in the highly polished brass. But within the reflection, there was something else, a shape moving behind the camera, behind Elias. It was a translucent angular silhouette, immense and vaguely insectoid, too large to fit in the corridor, yet clearly visible in the reflected brass. It had many legs and seemed to shimmer with the same faint blue light that emanated from the collar. Elias gasped, dropping the camera into the snow. The collar hadn't been a containment device for energy. It had been a tracking device, or perhaps a leash, placed on a sentient organism that was acting as the guard. Subject 79 had been wearing a collar designed by whatever horrific, immense creature was sealed inside the black chamber. The creature's movement was what had ruptured the structural seal. The cold, the isolation, the fear. None of it compared to the knowledge that he hadn't merely stumbled onto a ruin. He had briefly shared a space with an ancient, hostile entity trapped beneath the ice. A choice hammered at him. Do I race for the runway with the evidence that will save my career but condemn me as a madman, or do I sacrifice the proof, destroy the camera, and spend my remaining time praying for an escape that will leave Finn's death meaningless? He had perhaps 35 hours left. The choice was survival or truth. Step 10. The climax, Asom final, no limite du prazo. Elias chose the truth. He retrieved the camera, forcing the horrifying image out of his mind, and started the snowmobile. The small engine roared to life, a fragile bubble of noise against the infinite silence. He pointed the vehicle toward the coast. He rode for hours, driven by a manic energy fueled by grief and terror. He had to reach the main monitoring station, a simple, automated structure which might still have a functioning emergency radio before the ice dissolved. The clock was brutal. 2 hours remaining until the predicted collapse of the runway shelf. The journey was a blur of blue ice and black shadows. His focus narrowed entirely to the needle on the fuel gauge. He could make it, but only if he cut the turns, drove at maximum speed, and ignored the pain of the sub-zero wind lashing his exposed skin. He arrived at the prefabricated monitoring station with the fuel gauge needle resting on E. The structure was battered, half buried in drift, but the emergency antenna array was still standing. He scrambled inside, slamming the access hatch behind him. The interior was icy. The main power was clearly out, but the emergency radio, powered by a long-life tritium battery, should still be operational. He ripped off his outer glove and reached for the call button. He needed to transmit his coordinates and, crucially, the photos. The photographic evidence was the only thing that would save him from institutionalization upon arrival. As his finger reached the button, a noise began outside. Not the wind, and not the grind of the pack ice. It was a new sound, a high-pitched metallic chittering coming from the direction of the sea. Elias froze, his hand hovering inches from the radio. He recognized the sound immediately. It was the frequency he had heard emanating from the small brass box in the chamber. He looked out the small, frosted window. The distant, churning sea ice was no longer uniform white. Patches of black, hexagonal material were beginning to surface in the water, glistening wetly in the faint light of the distant moon. They were breaking through the ice shelf, emerging from the black ocean depths, and they were moving toward the station. They were the entities that the brass collar had tracked, the organisms Subject 79 had guarded, and the things visible in the photo reflection. They were enormous and moved with frightening speed, seemingly indifferent to the cold. Elias realized the true implication of the blue light and the contraction of the chamber. The chamber wasn't a trap, it was a cocoon, and Elias had released them. The collar had been the key, and he, in his reckless desire for knowledge, had used it. The chittering grew deafening. A massive black shape rose from the ice just 50 yards from the station, too large, too complex, its multifaceted eye structures shimmering blue. Elias screamed, jamming the transmit button down. He had only seconds. He initiated the emergency sequence, attaching the camera's output to the radio's data burst function. "This is Vance. Station X-ray 7, requesting immediate heavy extraction. Repeat, heavy extraction. The ice shelf is failing, and they're here. They are coming." He mashed the data transmission key, sending the coordinates and the terrifying macro images of the brass box reflection into the static choked air. A tremendous, crushing impact slammed into the exterior wall of the station. The structure groaned, tilting violently. Elias was thrown against the main console. He tasted blood. His final thought, as the metallic scream filled the air, was of the clock. Each hours, 0 minutes. The helicopter was either moments away, or it was too late. Step 11. The last revelation, seconda reversum, twist final. The air filled with the scent of ozone and the heavy, terrifying musk of the encroaching entities. Elias lay paralyzed for a moment, listening to the sickening, tearing sound as the black hexagonal limbs, like the branching symbols on the collar, scaled up to monstrous proportions, began to rip through the steel skin of the monitoring station. The screech of metal was immediately replaced by the high-pitched whump, whump, whump of rotor blades, impossibly close. The extraction helicopter, a massive military-grade Chinook, was dropping through the weather, defying the extreme conditions. They had received the transmission. Elias stumbled to the roof access hatch, driven by a surge of desperate adrenaline. He threw the hatch open and scrambled out onto the flat, snow-covered roof, just as the black claw breached the radio room below. The helicopter pilot saw him instantly and began the perilous maneuver of positioning the rescue sling in the high winds. Elias grabbed the sling, clipping the carabiner to his harness, just as the metal floor beneath him buckled. He was hauled upward, away from the shattered monitoring station, ascending into the relative safety of the air. He looked down. The creatures were now fully visible. 3 of them, immense and glistening like black crystalline spiders, moving with impossible agility across the unstable ice. They were not mammals. They were something alien, something engineered for the deep cold. As he was lifted higher, the pilot screaming through the helmet comms about the ice instability, Elias saw the final, catastrophic revelation. The second great reversal. The largest creature, the one tearing apart the remains of the station, was struggling. It wasn't digging for Elias, it was fighting against the ice shelf itself. As the creature wrenched itself free of the melting water, a cable snapped taut around its neck. Not a modern restraint. A thick, tarnished brass chain, hundreds of feet long, disappearing down into the fracturing ice. The creature was collared. Elias stared, the wind tearing the air from his lungs. The brass collar he had found on Subject 79 was not a key or a tracking device for these entities. It was a shackle. Subject 79, the polar bear with the ancient lineage, had not been a guard. It had been a successor. The colossal entities were the ones that were contained. The brass collar was not a piece of human history. It was a mechanism of a long-dead, terrifying intelligence that had once imprisoned these things in the earth. The ancient civilization that carved the Black Chamber hadn't created the creatures. They had entombed them, using the collars as a failsafe. The ice shelf, the entire containment field, was failing naturally due to rising temperatures, but Elias's presence, his obsession with the collar, had expedited the process, triggering the catastrophic breach. He hadn't unleashed one. He had initiated the failure of the global, millennial-long containment system. The creature fought the chain, its multifaceted eyes turning upward, focusing directly on Elias, dangling from the helicopter sling. The look was not one of rage, but of ancient, focused hatred. Just as the helicopter pulled free of the immediate danger zone, the creature finally tore its neck free of the brass chain. The chain fell away, disappearing into the churning water, and the massive alien entity was finally completely unrestrained. Step 12. Resolução agridoce. Vittoria com custo permanente. The helicopter raced southward, leaving the site of the disintegrating ice shelf and the freed black entities behind. The transmission of Elias's coordinates and his panicked data burst had been enough. When they landed at the military research base in Resolute Bay, Elias Vance was a ghost. He was treated for severe hypothermia and trauma, but the psychic damage was far deeper than the frostbite. He had the camera. He had the photos of the hexagonal scales, the skeletal remains of the super predators, and the final, horrifying image of the large, collared entity reflected in the brass box. His victory was survival and the evidence. The cost was everything else. The initial inquiry dismissed his claims as delirium induced by extreme cold and exhaustion. The scientific community declared the images a fabrication, noting the structural inconsistencies and the impossibility of the biological forms. Elias Vance's reputation, built on decades of painstaking fieldwork, was instantly destroyed by his own hubris. He was deemed unfit for further field research, his intellectual falla fatal permanently scarring his career. But Elias knew the truth. He sat in the sterile white room of the psychiatric facility in Ottawa, far from the Arctic Circle, the lingering scent of ozone and rust still in his nostrils. The only thing he had retained from the Arctic was the camera. The authorities had missed it during the initial confusion. He looked at the final image again, the massive alien creature, its head momentarily restrained by the brass chain. He realized why Finn's arm had been severed so cleanly. When the chamber sealed, it wasn't a trap for humans. It was simply reverting to its primary function, designed to lock down a contained threat. Finn had been caught in the crossfire of an alien security system. The resolution was bittersweet. Elias was alive, but professionally dead and psychologically broken. He had the truth, but no one believed him. He spent his days researching ancient mythologies, the stories of giants bound in ice, of things sleeping beneath the permanent frost. He was compiling the final terrible paper, not for publication, but as a warning. 2 months later, news reports began filtering in, tucked away on the back pages. Fishing trawlers operating further north than usual off the coast of Greenland reported strange seismic activity and unidentifiable colossal black shapes moving silently beneath the pack ice. The reports were vague, quickly attributed to gas leaks or deep-sea currents. Elias knew better. The containment was broken. The old world was waking up, thanks to a field biologist who couldn't leave a piece of ancient brass alone. He stared out the window at the familiar, gentle snow of southern Canada. It was white and clean, but he knew somewhere far north the snow was now contaminated with something cold, ancient, and utterly merciless. He had survived the ice, only to bring the cold truth back with him.